Hey everyone, let's jump into the themes and concepts of biology. So, one of the first things I want to point out is a structural thing. So, in our PowerPoints, you'll notice that on the right hand side, see my little pointer here, we have learning objectives. That's going to be on every content slide, and it will list the objectives, whatever they are, for each section from the book, and I'll highlight the one that we're talking about during that slide. That way you can keep track of what we're working on and what we're talking about. It also corresponds to the lists of them in your textbook and in the reading guides. All right, turn that back off. Okay, so our first objective is to identify the properties of life and then be able to describe them. All right, so we can get into that. Biology is the study of living things. Okay, that's fairly basic, like common knowledge. We know that that's what biology means. How do we define what life is? So over hundreds of years, biologists, actually probably more like 1,000 years, we've created this list of characteristics that must be present in order for a thing to be considered living. So for an object to be considered alive, it must display all of the properties. Okay, so we're going to go through that list of things. So again, all of these characteristics must be observable in the organism, and they must be observable in context, right? So, if they could do one thing at one time and one thing at another time, they might not be living. We'll look at that a little bit later. All right, so first is order. So living things are complex and ordered, structured. Sensitivity, or the ability to respond to stimuli, so respond to the environment around them. Reproduction, that they can reproduce. You have to be able to produce viable offspring to be living. All right. Adaptation, so environment is going to influence survival. Growth and development, so that you can grow and develop, as in change throughout your lifetime. Think of like a butterfly, right? Starts out as a caterpillar, growth and development. Regulation, this is big. Coordinating your internal functions, giving direction, right? Homeostasis, so maintaining a balance of those regulations inside your body, or even a single-celled organism has these things. And then finally, energy processing, which is having some kind of metabolism. Not in this list, but that is listed in your book, is evolution. Evolution and adaptation, depending on who you're talking to, we often put those two together because adaptation is a consequence of evolution. Anyway, we'll talk about it more. All right, so let's take a look at this first one. We're back with order, right? So organisms are highly organized structures that consist of one or more cells. So even in the simplest single-celled organisms, they're very complex. There's a lot going on inside those individual cells. At the lowest level, atoms that then make up molecules, which then in turn form larger structures like the cell membranes and components and the organelles, right? So even in a little single-celled guy. Now, multicellular organisms can consist of millions of individual cells, and they do have an advantage over single-celled organisms depending on the environment you're in. But one of the big advantages if you are multicellular is that your cells can be specialized to perform specific functions, and even sometimes they're designed to sacrifice themselves for the good of the whole organism or as part of growth and development. Really, really fascinating. It's really more part of second semester of this course, or if you ever take anatomy and physiology, learn a lot more about how cell sacrifice plays a really big role in overall organism functioning. All right. Response to stimuli. Organisms can respond to a huge different range of stimuli. Think of yourself, all the different things going on around you that your body can respond to. But even a plant can respond to environmental stimuli. It can bend towards the light. Or, there's some plants that when you touch them, they'll, a little spines will shift, or leaves will shift. There's a video link in your textbook that shows this process, and it's pretty interesting. Bacteria, little tiny bacteria, single-celled, they can be attracted to or not attracted and driven away from chemical stimuli and light stimuli. We call the chemical type chemotaxis, taxis, movement. So movement caused by chemical stimulus. If it's going towards that stimulus, it's a positive stimulus. If it causes the organism to move away, it's a negative stimulus. All right. Okay, we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide. So reproduction, adaptation, and evolution. Put those all together because they're so closely linked. So single-celled organisms reproduce by first duplicating their DNA. Okay, and that's true for all cellular reproduction. So it's one cell going, dividing into two. So they'll divide up their DNA equally, and if they have organelles, they'll disperse those evenly as well, and then they'll divide into two daughter cells. Your cells do that too. Now, when we talk about animal reproduction, there's kind of two different categories of it, and we'll talk about that more later. But as far as producing offspring in multicellular organisms, this is a little more complicated. We're not just going to make a copy of one of our cells and pass it along. We have very specialized reproductive cells, right? In animals, we have sperm and egg, but there are other examples of that too that you get even more complicated. Plants do some really interesting stuff. So when reproduction occurs, we're going to have DNA-containing genes passed from the parent organisms to the offspring. Sometimes the parent organism, it may just be one or it may be two. There are some really bizarre examples in plants and protists that involve 4 organisms. Really, really interesting stuff. What is also important to keep in mind, and this is part of the adaptation and evolution aspect, is your offspring will possess characteristics similar to your own because you have passed your genetic material, your DNA, onto them. It will be a combination if you have multiple DNA donors, right? But offspring will be similar to parents, whether that's fur color, like for the kittens there, right? Eye color, blood type, all of those things. So where do those traits come from, right? And so this is where we can start thinking about evolution. So the diversity of life on our planet is a result of mutations, okay? Mistakes in copying DNA. These are random changes, and it leads to changes very slowly over a long period of time. If a random change occurs that's passed on to your offspring that gives them an advantage, well, it will start dispersing itself through the population of that organism, and eventually you see more and more of it. Blue eyes are an interesting example of that. Let's see. So as the mutations add up, we end up with new traits. We have organisms that maybe you aren't as well adapted for an environment, so you have to seek out a different environment where maybe you have a better shot of surviving, or maybe you go extinct, right, if you don't possess the appropriate traits. So over time, this is populations, not single individuals. Very important distinction. But over time, a species, an organism that evolves characteristics to fit the environment, it's going to have greater reproductive success. Okay, and it will be subject to the forces of natural selection. Okay, so natural selection, adaptation. All living organisms are going to exhibit a fit for their environment. If they don't fit their environment, they're not very likely to survive in it. We're a really interesting organism in that we are very, on an individual scale, very adaptable. We have very, very adaptable homeostasis and regulation. Really neat stuff. So we refer to this fit for our environment as adaptation, and it is a consequence of evolution by natural selection. We'll talk more about it and get into these terms later, but And so this all operates in every lineage of reproducing organisms, whether you are a single-celled bacterium or something really complex like us, or some plants like orchids are genetically incredibly complex. Adaptations are not constant, all right? They happen as the environment changes around us. Natural selection causes the characteristics of individuals in a population to shift with environmental changes. When we see big environmental change, we do tend to see big changes in the organisms too, whether that be extinction rates increasing like we see right now, or sometimes it leads to proliferation of lots of new organisms. It just depends on what's going on. All right. Okay, homeostasis. So even the smallest organisms are complex and require a lot of different regulatory mechanisms to coordinate all their internal functions. Even a single-celled organism has a lot going on: transport of nutrients, response to stimuli, coping with environmental stresses. Homeostasis literally means steady state, okay? And it just refers to maintaining that stable internal environment that's required for life. If you think about a human, right? If you get too hot, we overheat, and it causes our membranes, our cellular membranes, to fall apart. That's not what you want, and your proteins to do things you really don't want. If we're too cold, we can develop hypothermia, and your organs start shutting down because the transport of things stops working. Or if you want to think about exercise, really interesting one is, all right, so let's say you go for a run. If your heart didn't increase its rate of beating, you would not be able to transport enough fresh oxygen to your muscles to continue running. So as you engage in exercise, your heart must beat faster to keep up the oxygen levels. So this is all just response to stimuli and maintaining the necessary amounts of things throughout your body. And we'll talk more about homeostasis throughout the semester. And then finally, energy processing. All right, you have to have metabolism, right? All organisms use some source of energy for their metabolic activities. Some organisms capture energy from the sun and convert it to chemical energy in the form of food, sugars. So plants do that, algae, some bacteria can do that too. Others are going to use chemical energy from molecules they take in. And that can be, in the case of environmental protists, right? So little single-celled critter living in a lake. They absorb nutrients through their cellular membranes. So they don't technically eat, they don't have mouths. Well, some of them have siphons anyway. But they can pull energy in from the environment, pull molecules in from the environment that they can then convert into energy. Or like us, right? We eat things, and our digestive tract breaks them down, allows the molecules to get into our bloodstream, and then we disperse it through our body to build new things and use the energy. Our breathing, our respiration is part of that process. We have to consume food, and we have to breathe in oxygen and breathe out CO2, which is also a byproduct of all of those metabolic processes. So energy processing is complex, and we're going to actually spend 2 separate chapters just on energy processing later in the semester. All right, let's take a look at an interesting example of, is this living? Viruses. Are viruses alive? So this has been something that's been discussed a lot. And I will tell you, you may encounter a virologist or two in your life, if you happen to run in those circles, who says viruses certainly are alive. But technically, let's take a look at some of these features. So viruses can be transmitted from one organism to another, and they can cause diseases. They don't all cause diseases, okay? But a fair few of them do. Are they alive? Well, they can attack a living organism. Their response to stimuli, it's maybe a stretch, but sure. They can reproduce if they're inside a host organism, and their reproduction causes disease. But viruses are not made of cells. They do not have a cell membrane. Sometimes they'll have pieces of membrane, but they're not a fully enclosed cell. They cannot reproduce on their own. They have to have a host. They can't even make the machinery. They hijack your machinery in order to replicate themselves. So how do we make the determination here? They do possess some of the properties for life, including the fact that they evolve, right? As they make copies of themselves, there are changes, and they are subject to evolution and natural selection. But here's the really important piece. They do not display the properties of life simultaneously. They can display a couple of them kind of independently of each other. So we generally speaking, we do not consider viruses alive. They also don't have a metabolism, and they don't have a homeostatic regulation because they are not a closed system like a cell is. So again, sometimes we talk about them like they're living because they are subject to evolution. They do reproduce, but they can't do all of it at once, and they're missing some of the properties. So other than the occasional virologist who feels very strongly about it, overwhelmingly, biologists are going to agree that viruses are not living. Okay, so that takes us through all of the properties of life and the descriptions of them. Next, we're going to jump into levels of organization of living things.